Hi, and welcome to our course on customer specific value propositions. And we're going to start by exploring what we mean by value story frameworks. But even before that, it's probably worthwhile defining what we mean by value. And here's a definition that I found quite useful. Value is an organizational and or a personal benefit that can be measured or expressed in financial, in operational, or in emotional terms. So that's a fairly broad definition of value, isn't it? Now, very often you'll hear from marketeers about value propositions. And I think what marketeers talk about most of the time is what I'll characterize as generalized value propositions. So these are standardized statements that seek to promote the value of a company's offerings uh, and how it will deliver. Hi, and welcome to our course on customer specific value propositions and to our first module where we'll introduce the concept of value story frameworks. But before I do that, I think it's probably worth defining what we mean by value. So here's a definition that I found particularly helpful. Value is an organizational and or a personal benefit that can be measured or expressed in financial, in operational, or in emotional terms. So that's a fairly broad definition of value, isn't it? And I think it's a useful one. So let's think about value propositions and about the difference between what I'd characterize as generalized value propositions and the customer specific value propositions that we'll be paying attention to in this course. So, a generalized value prop, the sort of thing you might get out of a marketing department, is a standardized statement that seeks to promote the value that a company's offerings will deliver to its customers. Now, because of its generalized nature, it typically seeks to be universally relevant to all of a certain category of prospect. And it's very widely used by marketeers. These generalized value propositions are often embedded in generic marketing materials. And again, the same message, though, typically ends up getting articulated to all potential customers in a given category. And very often the differentiation ends up revolving around features, advantages, and benefits of the vendor solution. Now, these generalized value propositions can certainly help to initiate a customer buying decision journey, but they become progressively less effective towards the end of that cycle or journey because inevitably we end up with a generalized message aimed at all similar prospects. Now, I'll contrast that with what I mean by customer specific value propositions. And that's our focus for this course. These value propositions are flexible frameworks that are designed to be uniquely customized to each potential customer's unique circumstances. They aim to be specifically targeted at each prospect. And this sort of concept is widely used by successful and effective salespeople, particularly in complex B2B environments, because every customer ends up with a value proposition that has been uniquely tailored to them. And the differentiation then can be based on the value of the business outcomes that that particular customer can expect to achieve. And this way of thinking about value propositions become progressively more powerful the further we get into our customers' buying decision journey. And what it amounts to, rather than a generalized message, of course, is a specific promise to be fulfilled for a specific customer. Now, there are 4 types of value story framework, depending on the situation and the circumstances. So, for example, if you're trying to persuade a customer to implement a new solution, or to renew an existing solution, or to add to an existing solution, or to upgrade from a legacy platform, there's some different sequences in which we need to convey the appropriate messages. So, for example, if we're trying to persuade our customer to implement a new solution, that requires what I'm going to call a why change story, answering 4 critical questions: why act, why now, why us, and why trust. If we're trying to persuade our customer to renew their use of an existing solution, well, that requires a why renew story. And that typically follows a sequence along the lines of demonstrating our proven value, suggesting there's more to achieve, looking to the future, and yes, rewarding the loyalty of our existing customer. Now, if we were trying to persuade an existing customer to add to an existing solution, well, that requires a why expand story. And we might start that why expand story by illustrating and agreeing our proven value, but also suggesting that there's now an opportunity to further grow that value. And at that point, the new solution sequence starts to become appropriate. In other words, why change now, why choose us, and why trust us. And then finally, if we're trying to persuade a customer to upgrade from a legacy platform, then this requires a why migrate story. And that might include the value that's been delivered by that legacy platform, perhaps introducing new realities which have emerged since that platform was implemented, identifying and agreeing that change is inevitable and that the migration will lead to a better future. So the story structures are somewhat different. Now, for the purposes of this course, we're going to focus on the new solution value story. And that's what the remainder of this course is going to address. So if we look at the new solution value story, there are 4 key questions that every customer needs clear answers to before they're going to be prepared to commit to adopt a significant new solution. And in the early phases of their buying decision journey, they're asking themselves, well, why do we need to act rather than continuing on our current path? In the middle of their buying decision journey, their attention turns to, well, even if we do need to act, why do we need to act now rather than later? And they need to be convinced of that. And also, why should they choose us rather than any other option? So these are sort of characteristic questions that the customer tends to want answers to in the middle part of their buying decision journey. And then towards the end of their buying decision journey, particularly if we're in some way an unknown quantity, either a brand new supplier or we're trying to persuade them to move into an area that we haven't previously worked with them on, then their attention turns to answering the 4th question, which is so why should they trust us to ensure that they achieve their intended outcomes? Now, this sequence is rarely perfectly linear. And as you'll probably be very aware, many prospects will find themselves revisiting the answers to the earlier questions as their buying decision journey evolves. So it's something of an iterative process typically. So if we think about trying to answer why they need to act, our prospective customers will want to contrast the painful consequences of their current issues with the positive benefits of their intended outcomes. And that'll be the thing that persuades them of the need to act. More on that later. And then if they have decided that it does seem that action is necessary, their attention turns to why do they need to act now? And when they're asking this question, They'll tend to be establishing things like their internal business case. They'll be evaluating the impact of the issue on corporate priorities, and they'll be weighing up the cost of delay. Again, more on this in later modules in this course. And then when they're considering what or who to choose, our prospects, of course, will be identifying and considering their options. They'll be agreeing their requirements. They'll be trying to choose the approach that is likely to result in the best business outcomes. Again, more on this in a subsequent module. And then the final layer is, why should they trust us? And before committing to our approach, again, particularly if there's anything about what we're proposing which is a bit of an unknown quantity, then the key stakeholders will want to be absolutely sure that their decision will deliver the desired outcomes, it will enhance their reputation, and it will minimize any risk of failure. So that's how those four key questions sort of pan out into somewhat more detailed considerations. Now, you might remember from some of our earlier courses this concept of life in the spaghetti bowl, the idea that our customers' buying decision journey is rarely linear. And given that, in any complex buying decision journey, our customers likely to revisit each of those questions, why act, why now, why us, and why trust, probably multiple times. So this isn't in any way a linear process. Life in the spaghetti bowl means that even if the customer thinks that one of these questions has been currently satisfactorily answered, they may still choose to revisit it later. So, in summary, the key takeaways from this module: when we think about trying to sell new solutions, that's where the framework that we're going to be presenting in the rest of this course is particularly helpful. It's used when we're making our first significant sale into a new customer, but it's also very relevant for any significant new projects in existing customers. And remember, our prospective customers are going to iterate through trying to find answers to the four key questions when they're trying to decide whether they ought to commit to that significant new solution. First, typically, their consideration is, so why do we need to act rather than just staying on our current path? Their second consideration is, even if we need to act, why do we need to act now rather than later? Their third consideration, even if we need to act now, what should we choose? Why should we choose you rather than any other option? And then finally, if there's any element of an unknown quantity about the proposed solution, it's, and why should they trust us to ensure that they achieve their intended outcomes? And they may well revisit each question as often as their buying decision journey evolves. And unless and until there are clear and compelling answers that make sense to all the stakeholders to each of these questions, your prospective customer may be unwilling to commit to action. So it is your responsibility as a B2B professional salesperson to ensure that your prospective customer is completely satisfied with all four answers to those four questions. Now, how do you get there? Well, I want to introduce to you the new solution value proposition framework. It's an editable and customizable on a page template. And if you haven't yet done so, I encourage you to download that from the resources section of this course now. And what it will do, and we'll go through each of these layers in the subsequent modules, it will guide you into progressively building and verifying the unique answers to each different customer's four key questions. Remember, they are: why do they need to change? Why do they need to act now? Why should they choose you? And why should they trust you? And it will establish, as we'll see, the foundation for a customer specific, truly compelling and action driving executive summary of your sales proposal. So please get yourself a copy of it now. So this ends the introduction. And as usual, at the end of each module, I want to ask you to pause and reflect for a moment and to ask you, how has this module helped you to think differently? And particularly how you're going to change the way you think about the importance of crafting customer specific value propositions in response to some of these ideas. And yes, even more importantly, I want you to think about what you might do differently as a result. What are you now determined to start doing that you haven't been doing before? What do you now realize maybe you need to stop doing? And how are you going to make what you were already doing even more effective as a result of these initial ideas? And it's always helpful, if you want to put some of those thoughts into practice, to write them down, to make those commitments to yourself, to put them into practice, to see how they pan out, to learn from the experience, and to continue to evolve. And I want to encourage you to do that. So there we have it. The sort of essential building blocks of crafting customer specific value propositions. And I hope those ideas strike you as being very relevant to what you're trying to do in crafting compelling proposals for each of your current and future sales opportunities, and that you'll want to put these ideas into practice. Now, I also hope that you'll want to join me for the next module, and that's where we look in a bit more detail about answering their question, why do we need to act? And I hope to see you online for that in the very near future.